some people are starting to think of China as they've magically resolved all of their internal problems and they're on a one-way trajectory to world takeover. And I don't think that's the case. I think China is much more fragile than people give it credit for. I'm Carl Minzner, author of End of an Era: How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. The origins for writing the book were a sense that I keep getting asked by folks in the audience, is China similar or different to 10 years, 15, 20 years ago? And I'm a law professor, so I often focus on law and politics. But I wanted to sit down and begin thinking, not just in law and politics, but also thinking about economics, thinking about religion, thinking about ideology, and just figure out how China today is similar or different with 30 years ago, with 60 years ago, and just walk through what I see as the changes or the differences. And as I did that, I just came to the natural conclusion that China today is in a pretty different position from where it was in 1980, 1990 on a range of areas. And that leads me to the conclusion that, in fact, the reform era, as we know it, is ending or is over. So let me underline first what I think the key factors of the reform era are. If we're thinking about China's post-1978 period, we're thinking about economics, we're thinking about politics, and we're thinking about ideology. And the key things to remember about the reform era was economically it was a period of rapid growth. Ideologically it was a period of openness to external influences, but also a relatively ideological flexibility within China itself, tolerance for a range of different views. And politically it was a period of partially institutionalized political reforms. It's not to say democracy, but the norms of China's one-party system became somewhat clearer. You had collective leadership rather than single-man rule. You had relatively stable succession norms and so on. And the story that I would tell is that with respect to the political norms, this flexibility for experimentation with alternative types of governance, village democracy, intra-party democracy and the like, as those types of reforms are launched, citizens start to use them. And initially, Chinese leaders themselves support these because they're looking for ways to address latent problems within their own system. They're worried about corruption, they're worried about abuse of power at the local levels, and they're looking for some checks that will permit them at the central level to better curtail their own local officials. But the problem comes about when citizens begin to use these channels not only to check local authorities, but they begin to raise first-order questions about the party power itself. And that's the point at which top-level leaders move in to undermine their own reforms. The even more tragic thing dynamic that I worry about is that the security impulse that flows from that, the desire to double down on control and repression, also has led them steadily to cut back on some of the other things, the ideological flexibility. You begin to tighten control over internal government discussions. You begin to curtail ability to solicit outside views. And that step by step begins to undermine many of the things that underwrote the China's story, the China success story that we're comfortable with in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. On the ideological front, the reform era witnessed a sort of a degree of tolerance. The party state backed away from the ideology was everything, which was the characteristic of the Maoist era. That permitted a range of things. First, it permitted a degree of openness for discussion internally. But also, as you tamp down the ideological tightness on society, you start to permit a range of other influences to flow in. So you begin to have a religion come back. You begin to have underground churches. You begin to have a range of different viewpoints circulate within Chinese society. And I think one of the other key things that's happened within the last 10 years or so, it's not just since Xi Jinping, it goes back a little earlier, but I do think party authorities themselves have looked at some of these ideological trends and they've begun to worry. They worry that communism essentially there's a vacuum in China. People do not believe in socialism or communism as a value system. And a range of different ideologies is out there. And the determination that's been made on the part of propaganda party authorities is that we need to begin to actively articulate a coherent ideological set of norms that can offer something people to believe in. The problem, of course, is China no longer, communism itself is a Western import, if you really start talking about Marxism, you raise uncomfortable questions about class revolution, in which the party itself is effectively standing on the side of the rich and the bourgeoisie, not the proletariat. So on the ideological front, the party's decision has been to pivot back to tradition and to look back to Chinese tradition and try to fashion a new kind of narrative that draws selectively from China's own tradition and fuses it with Marxist-Leninism and the likes in order to offer a sort of a new ideology. Now, inherently, the other result of this is it means if you start offering up a more clear and closed narrative of what it means to be China, what it means to be Chinese, it also starts to generate increasing conflicts with the people in China who fit least well into that more narrow narrative. So groups of believers, whether they're Muslim, Christian, or people in Hong Kong or Taiwan who fit less well into this very closed narrative of what it means to be Chinese.